At CareFM, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form and, if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. You're ready to move your business forward, but first, you need to find the right team. Start your search with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It can help you reach qualified candidates fast, ensuring your listing is the first one they see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. See the results for yourself. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Dripping in gold? That's cool. Dripping in Velveeta's supremely creamy golden cheesiness? That's respect. Elevate your drip with Velveeta's range of outrageously delicious dips and dishes. Shells, cheese, melty blocks, and heat and eat queso that go all in on indulgence. Flex on your fam with a creamy, cheesy masterpiece and go all in on what you love with Velveeta. Respect the drip and satisfy your cravings. Bring home the drip with Velveeta.
Many of the veterans I did interview that started out in Germany or Austria that later fought in the British forces, and there were 10,000 German Jews who fought for Britain. The vast majority of them were from families that were assimilated, whose fathers had fought in the First World War and were highly decorated. And because they were highly decorated, many of those veterans told me how their fathers didn't think that they would be at risk.
Hello. In 1937, a 17-year-old German arrived at Liverpool Street Station in London, not speaking the language, but with a strong sense of freedom, considering the place he had left. Klaus Ascher was Jewish and had found safety, but sadly his father was not so lucky. Klaus became Colin Ansom and joined the British Army, becoming a commando, one of Churchill's special forces conducting ungentlemanly warfare. Historian and author Helen Fry joins to discuss his life. Lots more history on the way, so please do share. But until then, it's Churchill's German with Helen Fry. Helen, welcome back to the pod. It's great to have you on for another book. This is on a regular annual basis. I'm very impressed.
Well, I don't know if it's quite annual, but it's great to be back. I am fitting in a couple of back titles. Yale think there's some stories which have now gone out of print, which we should slot in between my intelligence books and to reach a new audience, which I think is really fantastic.
Good stuff. Well, this is a really interesting story that is a biography of a man who had led a very interesting life, Colin Anson. And so, yeah, I was reading this, and as you make clear at the beginning, Colin is no longer with us. He was born in 1922, so that's no great surprise. But you knew him personally, I think.
I did. I knew him for a number of years, him and his wife. His wife also had a secret war, Alice, bless her. Yeah, I knew them for well over a decade, possibly longer, actually. You kind of lose track of time. I was very close to them. They were amongst the closest circle of veterans, and I used to visit them regularly. We used to have lunch together and became very, very fond of him. He was a real honourable gentleman, actually.
Right. Well, he has an extraordinary story that's unusual, actually. I mean, the book's called Ex-Troop Commando, so that suggests there's lots of action and all that good stuff. But I actually found the early part of the book really interesting because Colin did not have your average upbringing for a British commando, did he?
No, absolutely not. So he was born in Berlin, as you said, 1922, and he was born into a family. Well, the father was very politically aware. His father was Jewish, his mother was Protestant, and his father could see how things were going. In the 1920s, he was very involved politically with the defense minister, Gustav Noske. And so Colin's father, if you like, worked in the defense department. He was a decorated veteran of World War One. So Colin grew up in that kind of background. It was a family where they were taught to think. And of course, he didn't even know he was Jewish until Hitler came to power. And through Berlin, he sees these troops, very smart. And as a young lad, 6, 7, no, be a bit later, was it 12? Yeah, he's about, sorry, Ollie, you're going to have to.
22, so 1933, he'd be 11?
11, yeah, he's not quite, yes, he's nearly 11 when the Nazis come to power. And he sees these troops, these smart soldiers with their guns and stuff on the streets of Berlin. And he thinks it's all very exciting. And he's so excited. He's chatting to his dad about it. His dad says,
Are we talking brown shirts?
yes,
Right.
we are. And regular soldiers and stormtroopers, yeah. And his father says, no, look under the surface. And his father talks to him about the threats of the Nazi regime. And that's the first time that Colin realizes that he could be at risk because of he's got a Jewish father. But his father is very vocally anti-Nazi, and that in the end leads to his betrayal and his death in Dachau. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, but it's one that really shaped Colin in ways that were very profound, even 70 years later.
Well, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, that would. His father, though, you mentioned, and it's probably helpful for the listeners for those who aren't maybe aware of the sort of racial laws that in Nazi Germany, it wouldn't matter if you'd, as his father was, won an award for bravery during the First World War. That's irrelevant, isn't it?
It's totally irrelevant. In fact, many of the veterans I did interview that started out in Germany or Austria that later fought in the British forces, and there were 10,000 German Jews who fought for Britain, the vast majority of them were from families that were assimilated, whose fathers had fought in the First World War and were highly decorated. And because they were highly decorated, many of those veterans told me how their fathers didn't think that they would be at risk. They thought, yes, we understand the laws which Hitler was bringing in gradually, slowly in Nazi Germany, but we're not going to be at risk because they've got businesses, they've fought for Germany in the First World War. As I said, they've got medals, they're decorated. And so for some families, it was too late. By the time they kind of realize, certainly in the lead up to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 38, for Colin, it was very different. Colin's father had his finger on the pulse. He knew exactly what was happening in Germany. He tried to get up an anti-Nazi party to mount a coup. An incredible man, incredible bravery. So he's a rare German who'd been highly decorated, but realized this is, something has to be done. So he calls together the generals, German generals, and they say, oh, no, we're not going to mount a coup. They didn't have the courage. And Colin grew up with his father saying, just completely despairing of the lack of moral courage to stand up to that regime. And Kurt, his father was called Kurt Ascher, stood up to that regime, and he paid with his life.
Yeah, so what were the circumstances of his arrest?
Well, he was quite vocal, publicly, and they were sat in a sort of beer garden, and they had their dog, bless her, Luna, their dog, who's pictured in the book, this Alsatian dog. And Colin remembers very distinctly his father there with his stick, and he goes off to get a drink, comes back, And they're playing all this Nazi music and these slogans, and it's on and on. And his father's, is just outraged. He's saying stuff to Colin. And of course, Colin wasn't his original name.
No.
Klaus. He changed it when he joined the British Army. But yeah, somebody betrayed him, because this was not the first time that this had happened. To speak out vocally in public, you don't know who's watching. And the Gestapo came and arrested Kurt in front of Colin. And that was the last but one time he ever saw him. He saw him once in prison, just before his father was taken to Dachau concentration camp. And it was forever, quite rightly, forever imprinted on his mind, that moment. And it affected him. And I think, his father had brought him up with this moral compass that was underpinned by Colin's Protestant upbringing. So although he had a Jewish father, he's sort of half Jewish, he had a Protestant upbringing, and that was a very strong, moral, German, democratic kind of view. And that shaped him. And I think it also shaped what he goes on to do when he finally manages to flee and come to England.
Yeah, it was interesting reading. He didn't really feel... it wasn't a Jewish upbringing, was it?
No, not at all. In fact, he had no idea about anything Jewish in his background. Jewish paternal grandmother, grandparents. He had no idea until Hitler came to power. And his father was mounting this, he was mounting this resistance, or trying to the regime. Of course, his father had watched the putsch, the coup in Munich in 1923 when Hitler had tried then. I don't say he was an eyewitness, but he was there politically on the scene. So he was kind of trying to do the reverse, if you like, but didn't manage it. I mean, history would have been very, very different if he had. And then Colin talks about that moment when, as school children, you probably remember this in the book, they had to line the streets when Hitler was coming through the town. And by this point, he's in Frankfurt. They've moved to Frankfurt, and they all have to wave their little flags and stuff. And he just sort of stands there. But he came within inches of Adolf Hitler. And he says, if someone had taken him out then, history would have been very, very different.
Indeed, indeed. Well, okay, so he actually leaves Germany on the Kindertransport.
Well, he's attached to the Kindertransport. So this is something I think it's kind of very, very nuanced. We have to be careful about language here, because people are starting to believe he came out on the Kindertransport itself. Right. He was too old by just a few months.
Yes, he would have been, what, 16, 17?
He was just 17. Right. So you had to be 16 and under. So he was actually saved by the Quakers. So it's a really important story. We do forget that the Quakers saved adults and children, in actual fact. They did an awful lot to help the Jewish community and to get Jews out of Germany and annexed Austria. And Colin was one of those that came out with the help of the Quakers. But to get him out, there was one of the trains in February 1939. They sort of tagged him on to the end of one of the Kindertransports. So there was a group of children coming out on the Kindertransport, all 16 or under. And they said to Colin, well, you just tag along with them, follow them, and they'll make sure you're all right at the other end. And somebody from the Quakers met him at the other end.
And what were his feelings then when he arrived was it Liverpool Street he would have arrived at?
They came through Harwich and then by train to Liverpool Street. I mean, freedom, that sense of freedom. I mean, very traumatic to leave Germany, although he doesn't talk about the trauma of leaving. I think, nothing could really top the trauma of losing his father within 1 month of his father being in Dachau in 1937. And so he dies not for being Jewish, but for being a political dissident of the regime. Very important distinction at that time. So it's a new life. They're having the traditional English breakfast as English tea, and it's all feeling quite exciting for a young lad. But obviously he knows the situation. But at that age, you kind of don't think you're mortal. And he just he loved England. He loved England.
Well, so much so that you mentioned there are 10,000 volunteers from Germany,
Yes,
and he was one of them.
he was one of them. Yes. It's an extraordinary legacy that I promised those veterans we would keep that alive. And that's why I'm so pleased that Yale are republishing books that have been out of print for such a long time. Because, who's going to remember this extraordinary sacrifice they made? Because the likes of Colin and his colleagues, his comrades, they were still German, technically. Some of them said they were stateless, but technically they were, at the outbreak of war, enemy aliens, that dreadful term that they used at the time, enemy aliens of enemy nationality. And so
That was a British government term.
yes, and they couldn't be conscripted in the same way as our guys. So they all volunteered. They deliberately and voluntarily put their lives on the line. They enlisted in the British Army to fight for the country that saved them. And they all said that to me. They all had this view. Not all the veterans I knew were connected to each other. They didn't all meet and know each other. Some of them did. But they all had this feeling that this was their war and they were going to fight it. And Colin, absolutely. When he had chance to enlist in the British Army, as soon as he could, he did.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. The British Army didn't create dedicated regiments for this, did they? You would be distributed among throughout the army. That 10,000. He joined the Pioneers, didn't he?
Yes, so initially, from the end of 1939, he doesn't join till later in 1940, but from the end of 1939, you've suddenly got these refugees turning up at the recruitment centres saying, right, I'm signing up. And they're saying, oh, hang on. Well, any time between September and December 39, they were turned away. No, well, I'm sorry, you're of German nationality, goodbye. But by the end of 39, the government are thinking, well, actually, why can't we enlist them in the Pioneer Corps? That was the only unit open to them. We can't technically say it's non-combatant because the Pioneer Corps did carry arms at times, but these refugees were not allowed to carry arms. They had their pickaxe and shovel. So that was a time of great frustration because from 39 into 1940, 41, there were thousands of male. They were the men that enlisted into the Pioneer Corps, sort of digging for victory, forestry work after they'd had their training, forestry work, guarding docks like Pembroke docks, whatever it was, that's what they were doing. And they were thinking, well, hang on a minute, here we are in British Army uniform. This is not our idea of fighting Hitler.
It's not the glamour job, is it?
Well, they wanted to fight proper.
Yeah.
It's not that they were shy of the work, but they absolutely wanted to fight. They wanted to strike back. And so it wasn't until 1942 that the British government suddenly thought, hang on a minute, we've got all these German speakers, these fluent German speakers. We could use them for the special missions. So you get the small-scale raiding force, you get the commandos, you get special operations executive, you have X section, which was the German section of SOE, the special operations executive. And then it's not until 1943, by which time Colin's in the commandos, but in 1943, the others were allowed to transfer to pretty much any part of the fighting forces, including the Air Force, although most of them tried to, apply to become pilots, but were not. That was not open to them, with one exception. But
is that because the view was they might be tempted to fly back to Germany?
No, not that I found in the files. I think, and from what they were saying themselves, it was as difficult to get into the Royal Air Force as it was to get into the Royal Navy. It was this sort of superior, sort of British, it's a very British institution kind of thing. And those veterans that joined, there were only 25 of them actually, were allowed to go into the Royal Navy doing coding work linked to Bletchley Park, of course. And they were viewed on with suspicion by those on the ship, the ships that they were posted to. Well, what have we got some B German for on our ship? You know, what good's he to us? And then one of them actually located the final location of the Tirpitz battleship, and as a result of that, it was knocked out of the water. So they were doing very, very important work, but they had to prove themselves. Colin's story was very different from that because it started as soon as he was allowed to transfer to the fighting forces for special missions, and they were headhunted within their Pioneer Corps company. Casual chats. How would you feel about going behind enemy lines in uniform? Oh, no. No, I'm not one for going behind enemy lines, some of them would say. Or how about, would you be dropped back in as a civilian? And all these kind of discussions were going on, motivations. And then the mysterious figure disappeared. And Colin got this letter for an interview in London. I believe he was at Pembroke Dock in Wales at the time. And he had this mysterious sort of letter with this interview, had no idea what he was going for. And then only when he'd succeeded in all of the stages that he was posted, he met the skipper, Brian Hilton Jones, for the first time. And it wasn't until they started their training even that they began to think, oh, this is some very interesting training, very unorthodox training for a regular army unit.
At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
Yeah, I can imagine, because the Pioneer Corps, as we've discussed, it's not exactly abseiling down cliffs and that sort of thing, is it? So, I mean, physically, it must have been quite a change for him. Did he talk about how, was it a shock, or was he sort of so motivated that he could overcome, the mind is a powerful thing, and could he overcome these kind of the physical demands of being in an elite unit like that?
Yeah, well, he was very physically fit. I mean, even in his late 80s and 90s, when I knew him, you could see instantly that he'd been in special forces. I mean, he still had an incredibly toned body. I mean, he'd stopped going to the gym, but well, I'm not sure if he'd ever gone to the gym, but he used to fly glider pilot. He was a glider pilot post-war. Of course, someone charismatic like that. But yeah, they took it in their stride. Some of them passed. Most of them passed. Some of them wouldn't. So it was designed really tough course to weed out anyone that wasn't up to it, of course. But they're an interesting group, this X troop, because they are primarily German and Austrian, Jewish refugees. There's a Hungarian amongst them, again, Jewish, had to flee. And they train together. They're based in Aberdyfi in West Wales. They received training in Scotland at Arisag, as the other commandos did. But this X troop, it was known as, didn't serve together. And that was the very deliberate policy at the beginning, that they would be broken up into 2s and 3s and posted to other commando units, commando brigades, Royal Marine Commandos, and then they would serve in all of those kind of operations, whether it's Sicily and Italy or D-Day landings. So theirs was a very different unit from the French unit, the commandos, or the Belgian commandos. They would serve together and they trained together. Having said that, there was still a sense of brotherhood, even though they knew that there would only be 2 or 3 of them going together in action.
Was that for their own protection, so that if a unit was captured, then you know what would happen if the Germans discovered that they were German fighting against their own nationality, but also Jewish?
No, it was a deliberate policy because it was believed they would be useful, and they were, for the other regular commando units. So they would be used for special intelligence, they would be used for interrogation, because the commandos did capture prisoners in the war, in their missions. And going behind enemy lines, they would be very, very useful to talk German as well. So that was a very deliberate choice, not about their survival. What protected them, and this is what was hoped to protect them, was that they changed their German names to English sounding names. But they were not allowed to choose. This is a funny bit of the research. They could choose any surname they liked. It was suggested they kept their initials because it made it easier, especially if they had, like in his case, Colin has AC on his handkerchief or something. So to make it easy, try and keep the same letter for your new surname. Well, the ones that he'd wanted had been taken by the men in front of him. They were not allowed to have Churchill or a.
Did they all want Churchill? They all
Well,
wanted Churchill.
and Montgomery. Well, they were not allowed Churchill. They were not allowed Montgomery, and they were not allowed double-barreled aristocratic surnames. I love it. So they could have anything else, and all the other ones that he thought of, thinking about
Wellington,
well,
Marlborough.
he had to think of something. Yeah, they'd all gone, Andrews, Anderson, all that kind of thing. And at that moment, when he sat with his piece of paper, they'd all been given their paper to write down their new names. This Anson aircraft went over, and he said, that's it. And that's how he chose his surname Anson, from Asher. He was Klaus Asher.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, looking at you've got a wonderful map early on in the book that shows, one of the operations that he was involved in,
yes,
which is the invasion of Sicily.
He was, and there are very few, as far as I can tell, eyewitness accounts now of Sicily. I mean, we have the war diaries, but from a commando perspective, I struggle to find any eyewitness accounts. So I think his account of the landings in Sicily are a really rare opportunity to understand what was it like for those commandos going ashore at dawn.
Yes. So I was speaking with Gavin Mortimer, who's been writing about the SAS in the invasion of Sicily. So this actually goes quite well, which is why the two will complement each other, the
brilliant
episodes. But I think the SAS were involved a little bit further north, but the commandos, they go in just on the sort of, for the listeners' sake, I'll put a link in for the map so you can see where we're talking. But it's basically the southeast, quite literally peninsula of Sicily that they attack, isn't it?
That's right, and they're ultimately heading up to Syracuse, and then they get on a ship to go round the bay to Augusta, and that's the landing he's about to do a week after. So they land on the 10th of July 1943, to put a precise date on it. There's a date he could never forget. The 17th, his little unit, he's first with 40 Royal Marine Commando, then 40, he serves with 41 Royal Marine Commando. But their group of men go back onto the ship, sail around the bay to mount another landing. This is the 17th of July 1943. So he's on HMS Queen Emma, and there are a number of ships in the bay, and they're going to set sail, but theirs is the only one that's visible to the German attack, the Stuka pilots. And because what they do is they lay a smoke screen to protect the other ships, but nobody can protect them because they're the only ship that can be seen, and it is attacked. The attack comes from nowhere, literally, and they suddenly hear the screaming sirens, and effectively Collins hit, and he has a very nasty injury to the skull, which of course he doesn't realise to start with, and he's busy saving his mates, his comrades. And I don't know if you want to go into this detail, whether we let the readers read it for themselves.
Yeah, but it's quite gory. I will warn the readers, but it's unbelievable. I couldn't believe I was reading that he was able to have a conversation.
I know. And then, well, he does sort of get a bit, passes out after a while. But he goes to the medical officer the next morning, and he's already taken his helmet off to shelter his colleague who's been hit in the abdomen. And I mean, unbelievable. And he's feeling a bit strange, but he goes to the medical officer, and the medical officer goes quite white when he looks at him. He's got bits of his brain hanging out, and Colin doesn't realise this. I mean, he starts to feel a bit cold. He thinks he feels a bit of blood. He's got a little bit of blood on him, and he says, "I need a bandage from I've knocked my head." Also, I've been hit, and of course he's got shrapnel.
A little scratch. He's something like that.
That's what he thought. Well, he couldn't see the back of his skull. But this medical officer went white and just said to him, "Well, just sit in the corner there and we'll be back in a moment," kind of thing. And they're evacuating all the wounded. And there are some casualties, yes, but there are also fatalities, including one of the commanding officers and one of the medical officers as well. And Colin says to me, "Well, I thought they left me. They evacuated me. I was literally the last one to be evacuated." And he said, "I thought that, all the really seriously injured were being taken off first." And then he sort of looks at me and says quite calmly, "Well, actually, they left me to last because they didn't expect me to survive the night." He found out that later. And then an extraordinary moment, he goes on to have an operation, a brain operation, to take out, well, he didn't manage to take out the shrapnel. It was too dangerous. So it was still embedded 70 years later when I interviewed him. So he couldn't go in an MRI scanner. He had to be very careful going through airport security because he still had this lodged in the back of his brain. But they performed this brain surgery in a tent in the field. There was a sort of van, sort of truck thing with a tent on the back, and Canadian nurses. So it was the Canadian 151 Lightfield ambulance. He was said, "Do you remember which unit it was that saved my life?" And they saved his life. I mean, he died on the operating theatre, and they revived him. Apparently, he was why can you say he was clinically dead? He did sort of die. Yeah, about 20 minutes, they managed to sort of took his heart out and was massaging it, doing all sorts. And it's like, oh my gosh. But he survives. And then he goes on to recover in Cairo. So he's transferred to Cairo. He's still got a bit of a sort of open bit, and they have to do a skin graft on his head later, but they can only do that when they know there aren't tumors growing. So this is in 1943, when the medical advances wouldn't be anything like they are today. It's extraordinary. And he has 9 months of recovery. And then he says, commanding officer says, "Right, well, we'll give you a nice job in London. We're going to post you back, intelligence work, whatever it is. We're going to do." "Oh no," he says, "I want to go back and fight."
It is quite extraordinary, actually.
And he does go back and fight. He joins his comrades. He says, "I want to join my brothers," as he called them. And these were British commandos born in Britain. "I want to go back and do my bit." And he does. He goes back in missions behind enemy lines into Yugoslavia, Albania, and he is the first Allied soldier to liberate Corfu. I mean, unbelievable. And I said, this just gives our listener a broad brush of his incredible story. I do try to keep it as far as possible in his words. I think it's important to hear his voice in the book, but also to understand just how significant his war was. And I thought, this has got to be told. But it took me several years to convince him. You have to respect his wishes. He was happy for a little cameo piece to go in one of my other books, but a whole biography, I don't know who's going to want to read my story. And I said, yes, but this is unbelievable. It's heroic. It's courageous. No, he said, I was no hero. And I called my introduction, "I am no hero." He said that to me. We weren't heroes. Well, let's put that aside. Let's forget the hero bit. I think, and there came a moment I said, I think it's really important that future generations understand the cost of freedom. "Oh, all right then," he said. "But I don't want anything, there'll be nothing sensationalized. No. We didn't scalp the heads of Nazis," Tarantino film. No, I understand that. He got so cross about that film. And he did agree, but it took so long to convince him the importance is for posterity. It's not a focus on him in an odd sort of way as being some big hero.
Well, it's an incredible life even before he reaches the commandos. But Helen, this has been great. Links are in the show notes for listeners if they want to click on that and read about an incredible life of Colin Anson. Now, he died 7 years ago, him and his wife within 11 days of each other.
They did, yes.
It's something that interested me because the book, was it first published?
So it was published in 2010.
Right. And he was then presumably happy because you had followed his instructions?
Yes. And the book has I've updated it, and I've now been able to definitely check his timelines against the official war diaries, and they're spot on. Absolutely spot on in the units, which is great because some people say to me, well, what about these eyewitness accounts? Have they elaborated? Have they made it up? How close is it to reality? But he had a perfect memory.
Oh, well, that makes for a wonderful subject for the book. But Helen, thank you for this. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more history on the way, so if you can give a kind review, I'd be most grateful. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.